So once upon a time, there was this thing called America, okay? And then there was this other thing called Europe. And European powers like England, France, and Spain were like, whoa, look, that's like not Europe. Wow, interesting. So they started colonizing it. Spain got the southern part of it. And England and France both colonized in the middle and north. Eventually, after all the colonization, there was a debate between England and France over who would control the Ohio River Valley, which was essential for the European fur trade. And Britain ended up winning, but they had a heckload of debt. So they went up to their buddy, the 13 colonies that they established in America, and were like, hey, you have a lot of nerve walking up to me, Britain, after that stinky proclamation of 1763 you passed. Yeah, so about that, we're also going to need something else. Ugh, what is it? So we need a bunch of money, so we're going to tax you. Yeah, no, we're not doing this. Oh, well, that's too bad, because you don't really have a choice. So they imposed the Sugar Act, which mostly affected merchants. It taxed stuff like sugar, molasses, and rum. This first taxation wasn't as bad as the ones to come. Eventually, merchants got sick of paying the tax and began smuggling molasses and sugar from the Caribbean. So it was kind of a big flop for Britain. So it was repealed in 1766. Now the Sugar Act came as a shock to the colonists, since for a long time they had kind of just been enjoying themselves and doing whatever they wanted. Now you might be thinking, wait, why are the colonists upset? It's just taxes, just some little taxes. They tax some molasses and sugar. Well, the reason they were upset was because they didn't have a seat in Parliament, Britain's lawmaking body, to negotiate if they wanted taxes, and if they did, how much money they would pay. So, as I said, the whole thing was kind of a financial flop for Britain, so they needed another way to raise money. And they were like, hey, we should do another tax. And so, the Stamp Act was imposed, which taxed pretty much all paper products, like pamphlets, almanacs, newspapers, legal documents, and dice and playing cards. Now, this got the colonists really upset, because this time it didn't just affect merchants, it affected pretty much all American colonists, and protests throughout the colonies began. And many of these protests would be extremely violent, often targeting British stamp collectors, often even pouring scalding hot tar on their bodies and feathering them, or hanging them in effigy. Now, you might be thinking, whoa, all the colonists were doing that? It seems to hurt. That was very intense. Poopy colonists. That's mean. That's very mean. But it wasn't all colonists who were doing that. It was mostly a radical group, which was led by the previously mentioned John Hancock and the alcoholic man, Samuel Adams. Now, Britain could see that this was a big problem, so it was repealed in 1766, but they snuck in a little something, which was the Declarative Act, which said, I have the right to tax you, and you have the right to shut it. And the colonists thought they wouldn't have to pay any taxes anymore. But then, in 1767, some dude in Parliament was like, hey, let's make the colonists pay more taxes. And so the Townshend Acts were passed. It taxed lead, paint, china, tea, and glass. Now, this made the colonists even more angrier than they were before, which is like super angry. On March 5th, 1770, in Boston, local children began harassing the British troops. by throwing snowballs and oyster shells at them. The British then raised up their guns and told the children to leave. And then when the children ran away and told their parents, which gathered a massive crowd, there was confusion everywhere. The colonists were throwing things at the British, and the British were feeling extremely more and more intimidated by the minute. And then someone fired. Ended the chaos. The other British soldiers fired as well. What resulted were the deaths of 5 people. One of them, Crispus Attucks, was an escaped African slave and considered to be the first person killed in the Revolution. An engraving by Paul Revere, a Boston blacksmith, showed the British soldiers brutally hosing down the colonists with their guns. But this engraving has proved to be very inaccurate for a multitude of reasons, like the fact that there wasn't any snow on the ground, which it was snowing during the massacre, and that random gun sticking out of the butcher shop, even though that's not where the massacre took place. It was in the town hall. Arguments began to take place between colonists and loyalists, but the one thing they agreed on was that there had to be a trial. But there could be no one brave enough to stick up for the British soldiers, right? Well, a young Boston lawyer named John Adams stepped up to the position. He said that even though he was a patriot, he thought that everyone deserved a fair trial, and ended up winning the case, with only 2 of the men facing consequences, which was literally just having the word M imprinted on their finger for murder. So in case they got caught for murder again, then they would get a more harsher punishment. The years between the Boston Massacre and the Boston Tea Party were kind of cool-down years, until in 1773, Parliament passed the Tea Act, and in response to that, the Sons of Liberty went aboard a British tea merchant ship, disguised as Mohawk Native Americans, and dumped 342 chests of tea into the Boston Harbor. The British were enraged by the Act of Defiance and passed the Coercive or Intolerable Acts. These acts forced colonists to house British soldiers, dissolved the Boston government, and only allowed supervised town meetings, closed down the Boston Harbor until the tea reparations were paid back, and protected British officials from all colonial prosecutions. In response to these acts, the 12 delegates from 12 of the 13 colonies met in Philadelphia for what is known as the First Continental Congress, where they discussed the issue of the British taxation and the acts. Throughout the colonies, men who were ready at a minute's notice, known as Minutemen, prepared for what might be war against Britain. And then, on April 19th, 1775, a group of British soldiers, led by General Thomas Gage, marched from Boston to Concord to take colonial supplies. But Minutemen were already expecting them, since spies had informed them that the British were marching there. And then, someone fired, starting the Revolutionary War.